Hi, we are Catherine Jones and Kelly Fussman, and we'll be talking about the article Spontaneous Gesture Production and Lexical Abilities in Children with Specific Language Impairment in a Naming Task. To give you a little bit of background about the use of gesture in typically developing children, previous research has shown that gesture tends to precede language development, and also gestures are related to lexical and syntactic development. In addition, co-speech gestures, or gestures occurring simultaneously with speech, can support spoken semantic information by either reinforcing or adding to the information presented with speech. So to reinforce information, you might point to a bottle and say bottle, so the information is redundant, or to add info, you might point to the bottle and say open. To give you more background about gesture in children with specific language impairment, previous research has indicated that children with SLI benefit from gestural input for their lexical development, but as for the production of gestures, there are more conflicting or confusing results. So in one study, they found that children with SLI produce more gestures that add info, but in additional research, this has either not been replicated or has been replicated in children with expressive SLI, but not in mixed expressive receptive SLI. In addition, one study has shown that children with SLI produce more gestures overall and also use more co-speech gestures, and finally that they produce more information adding gestures compared with typically developing children. And another interesting finding is that one study found an association between the use of gesture and language skill in children with expressive SLI, but not in typically developing peers, which could indicate that gestures might be compensatory, filling in some of the gaps that there are in the expressive language domain. So building off of previous research, the present study aimed to extend previous research, which was predominantly in school-age children, to preschoolers, and in addition they wanted to include two control groups, so including both a chronologically age-matched group and a language-matched group, whereas most previous studies included only the age-matched group. In addition, they wanted to compare gesture use both during verb production and noun production in these two groups of children. So for the research questions, the overarching question was, what role do co-speech gestures play in lexical production in preschool-age children with expressive specific language impairment, or ESLI? And their three more specific questions were, they wanted to assess the accuracy of spoken answers, so is there a difference in spoken lexical abilities of children with SLI versus typically developing children? And they wanted to look at the modality of expression used in a naming task. So are there differences in production of spoken responses versus gestural responses in children with SLI versus typically developing children? And finally, is there a semantic relationship between the spoken and gestural modalities? So what is the function of gestures in relation to speech? Is it reinforcing the information or adding information? And are there differences in these different groups of children?
There were three groups of participants in this study: 15 children with expressive language impairment, mean age 4 years, 7 months, 15 age-matched children, and 15 language-matched children with a mean age of 2 years, 4 months. The task used was a picture naming game consisting of a noun subtest with 20 pictures consisting of different objects that could be named, and a predicate subtest with 20 pictures that were used to elicit verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. For example, the picture on the right of the girl swimming could be used to elicit the verb swimming. The subtest order was counterbalanced, all children were tested at home with the parent present, and all the sessions were videotaped in order for the sessions to be transcribed at a later time.
Results were reported for 4 measures, the first of which being accuracy of the children's productions. It was found that language-impaired kids have fewer correct spoken answers than their age-matched peers, but they had more correct spoken answers than did their language-matched peers. Language-impaired kids and language-matched peers had significantly more phonological simplifications in their answers than the age-matched peers. Language-impaired kids and their age-matched peers both had more unintelligible answers than the age-matched group. On the other hand, Language impaired kids and their age matched peers had more semantic errors in their answers than did their language matched peers. As you can see, we have marked the significance for each of those findings as well as the effect size. Second, results for the modality in which the children's answers were conveyed were reported. Unimodal spoken answers consisted of only verbal answers, while bimodal answers had both verbal and gestural components that at least partially overlapped in time. That's like if I were verbally saying hello to you and waving my hand at the same time. The data show that language impaired kids and their language matched peers used the unimodal spoken modality less often than their age matched peers. But on the flip side, language impaired kids and their language matched peers gave more bimodal answers than their age matched peers. Third, the authors reported data for types of gestures used by the groups. But first, let's define what gestures were measured. Deictic gestures include pointing and showing. Almost all of the gestures produced in this study were deictic, specifically pointing. Pointing was defined as an extension of the index finger or other fingers, either directed to or touching the target. Representational gestures express the communicative intent to depict through hand movement the meaning of the picture or meanings associated with the object or action represented in the picture. In particular, these gestures may depict actions represented in pictures intended to elicit verbs. So for instance, for a picture of a girl swimming, the examinee might move his or her arms forward alternately to represent swimming. The data show that deictic gestures were used most frequently for all three groups than were the representational gestures. Language impaired kids and their language matched peers used both deictic and representational gestures more often than their age matched peers. Fourth and finally, data on the semantic relationship between gestures and speech were reported. There were two categories for semantic relationships between gestures and speech. One, gestures that reinforce spoken information, and two, gestures that added information to the spoken answer. Gestures reinforcing speech conveyed information that was redundant with what was said. Gestures adding to speech provided semantic information that was not conveyed through speech. Results show that gestures reinforcing speech were the ones most frequently observed in all groups, but the language impaired kids used them the most, and the age-matched kids used them the least. Language impaired kids and their language matched peers used more gestures that added information to speech than did their age-matched peers. For both aforementioned categories, the expressively language impaired kids used more gestures for predicates than nouns. So the take-home message that you can get from these results is that children with language impairments seem to rely more on the use of gestures to communicate. This makes sense due to their impaired language abilities. Language impaired kids do not show the same preference for the spoken modality as do their typically developing peers. They also use gestures differently from language matched peers, which is interesting to note.
So in terms of clinical implications, first of all, family teachers and clinicians should be aware that children with SLI may be using gesture to convey meaningful information, as in the case of, for example, adding information that isn't present in their spoken language. So for example, they could support word learning by providing an appropriate spoken language model in response to a gesture that's produced by a child with SLI. In addition, the authors suggest that children with SLI might be encoding more information in a visual spatial modality, such that that could partially explain why these children might be using gesture in actually a different way from language matched and age matched peers. So to build off of that difference in encoding, teachers and clinicians and caregivers could build off that to improve language knowledge by talking about the visual spatial features of objects, actions, or scenes.
If you'd like to look at the full article, the citation is at the top of this slide, And the other sources that we used in this presentation are listed below and on this next slide. Thanks so much for listening, and please feel free to direct any questions that you may have to me, Kelly Fussman, or Catherine Jones at our email. Thank you.